The illusion of neutrality. The justice system is often portrayed as an impartial mechanism designed to maintain fairness and order in society. We are told that laws exist to protect us, that courts deliver unbiased rulings, and that legal institutions function above personal or political interests. But is this really the case? Or is the legal system a carefully constructed tool that serves those in power while giving the illusion of neutrality? To answer this question, we must look beyond the surface and examine the historical foundations of the modern legal system. Laws have never emerged in a vacuum. They are shaped by the social, political, and economic forces of their time. The legal system was not designed to protect everyone equally. It was built to maintain control, ensure obedience, and reinforce existing hierarchies. From the earliest codified laws to modern constitutions, legal frameworks have consistently favored the ruling classes, criminalizing behaviors that threaten the status quo while legitimizing the power of elites. If we assume that justice is about fairness, then the legal system should treat all individuals equally, regardless of wealth, race, or social status. But history tells us otherwise. Laws have always been written and enforced in ways that serve dominant groups, while disproportionately punishing marginalized communities. From medieval monarchies using laws to suppress peasant revolts, to modern democracies maintaining economic and racial inequalities through legislation, justice has always been strategic, not neutral. Law as a mechanism of power, not morality. Most people assume that laws reflect a universal sense of morality, that certain actions are criminalized because they are inherently wrong. But this assumption is misleading. The law does not define morality. Those in power define the law. Throughout history, legal systems have justified atrocities, from colonialism and slavery to segregation and economic exploitation. What is considered criminal is not a reflection of moral truth, but a reflection of who holds power and what they seek to control. Take, for example, the war on drugs. While marketed as a moral crusade against substance abuse, it has functioned primarily as a tool of social control, disproportionately targeting low-income communities and people of color. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical corporations responsible for opioid epidemics and financial elites involved in money laundering schemes often escape severe punishment. This selective enforcement is not a flaw of the system, it is a feature. Laws are applied strategically to punish the powerless while protecting the powerful. Foucault argued that modern legal systems do not simply punish crime, they define it. The state has the power to decide which actions are labeled as criminal and which are seen as acceptable, even when the harm caused is the same. Consider how street theft is criminalized with harsh penalties, while corporate fraud that destroys thousands of lives is often resolved with fines. This is not about justice. It is about who gets to decide what justice means. The hidden function of courts and legal institutions. When we think of justice, we often picture courtrooms, lawyers arguing cases, judges making decisions, and juries weighing evidence. The courtroom is supposed to be a space where truth prevails and justice is served. But in reality, the legal system is not about truth. It is about performance. Courtrooms function as theatrical spaces where narratives are carefully controlled to serve specific interests. The law is full of legal loopholes, procedural tactics, and financial barriers that make true justice nearly impossible to achieve. Wealthy defendants can afford top-tier legal representation, hire expert witnesses, and delay proceedings to their advantage. Meanwhile, public defenders are often overworked and underfunded, leaving lower-income defendants vulnerable to harsh sentences, even when innocent. In many cases, the outcome of a trial is determined not by truth, but by resources, influence, and political interests. Judges and prosecutors, far from being neutral figures, often serve as gatekeepers of power. Their decisions reinforce systemic biases, ensuring that certain groups remain oppressed while others benefit. Consider how harsh drug sentences devastated entire communities, while white-collar criminals responsible for financial crises often receive minimal punishment. The courtroom is not an arena for justice. It is a mechanism for maintaining the illusion that justice exists, while in reality it operates as an extension of power. Justice as a performance, not a reality. So, if the legal system was never designed to be fair, why do so many people believe in it? The answer lies in its ability to manufacture legitimacy. The justice system survives because people believe in its myth. It presents itself as objective, rational, and necessary, despite overwhelming evidence that it disproportionately benefits those in power. Legal language, rituals, and symbols, such as judges' robes, grand courthouses, and legal jargon, create a sense of authority and credibility. These elements are not just aesthetic, they serve a psychological function. They convince the public that the legal system is something greater than human bias, that it operates on principles of fairness rather than manipulation. But behind the spectacle, justice is little more than a carefully controlled illusion. Even when injustices are exposed, wrongful convictions, biased sentencing, or police corruption, there is a tendency to view them as isolated failures rather than inherent features of the system. This is intentional. The legal system allows for small reforms and occasional acts of justice, but only to preserve the larger illusion. By fixing minor issues while leaving structural inequalities intact, it ensures that people continue to believe in its legitimacy. The real question is, if justice has always been an illusion, can it ever be real? Can we imagine a system that does not serve power, but truly serves people? This is what we will explore in the next sections as we dismantle the very foundations of justice and uncover how deeply the illusion runs. The myth of universal morality. Most people believe that laws exist because certain actions are inherently wrong, that murder, theft, or fraud are universally immoral. But history tells a different story. What we define as crime is not an objective truth. It is a social and political construct. Throughout different cultures and historical periods, actions that were once legal became criminalized, while others that were once considered crimes became legal. This raises a fundamental question. Who decides what is right and what is wrong? Consider alcohol prohibition in the United States during the 1920s. Overnight, drinking became a crime, even though it had been socially acceptable for centuries. Decades later, prohibition was reversed, proving that the definition of crime was never about morality. It was about who had the power to enforce their rules. Similarly, homosexuality was criminalized for most of modern history, even though it caused no harm to society. Meanwhile, acts of war, corporate exploitation, and environmental destruction, despite causing mass suffering, are often not considered crimes at all. Michel Foucault argued that the criminal justice system is not about enforcing morality, but about defining and controlling deviance. Those in power decide which actions threaten their authority and label them as criminal. The law is not a neutral reflection of good and evil. It is a strategic tool to preserve the interests of the elite while keeping the masses in check. Laws as tools of social control. If crime is a social construct, then laws are not designed to protect people equally. Instead, they serve as a weapon of control that targets specific groups while shielding others. Throughout history, those in power have used the legal system to criminalize behaviors that challenge their authority while protecting their own interests. For example, during the civil rights movement, black activists were often arrested for disturbing the peace or trespassing, even though they were simply protesting injustice. Meanwhile, white supremacist groups that used violence against them were rarely prosecuted. The same pattern can be seen today. Minor drug offenses disproportionately send poor individuals and people of color to prison, while massive financial crimes committed by the wealthy are often ignored or punished with mere fines. The so-called justice system is not about justice at all. It is about keeping certain populations under control while ensuring that those who benefit from the system remain untouchable. Police forces, courtrooms, and prisons function as mechanisms to enforce the existing power structure, not to create fairness, the criminalization of poverty and dissent. One of the clearest signs that the legal system is about control, not justice, is the way poverty itself has been criminalized. In many countries, being homeless, unable to pay fines, or even loitering in public spaces can result in arrest. But why is being poor treated as a crime? Because criminalizing poverty keeps marginalized groups powerless, forcing them into cycles of debt, imprisonment, and state surveillance. At the same time, the legal system punishes those who resist it. Whistleblowers who expose government corruption, activists who challenge corporate greed, and journalists who uncover state crimes often face harsher punishment than the crimes they reveal. This is not an accident. It is a deliberate strategy. Silence dissent while ensuring that the wealthy and powerful remain immune to consequences. Consider the case of Julian Assange, who exposed war crimes but was branded a criminal, while those responsible for the crimes he uncovered faced no consequences. Or Edward Snowden, who revealed the U.S. government's mass surveillance programs and was forced into exile. The message is clear. Questioning the system is a greater crime than the injustices it perpetuates. The blurred line between criminals and ordinary citizens. We are taught to see criminals as others, as dangerous individuals who must be locked away for the good of society. But if crime is simply a social construct, then what really separates a criminal from an ordinary citizen? In reality, many of us commit crimes every day without even realizing it. Speeding, jaywalking, downloading copyrighted material, or even lying on official documents can technically be considered crimes. But the law is not applied equally. A wealthy person caught evading taxes can negotiate a settlement, while a poor person caught stealing food might end up in jail. The distinction between a criminal and a law-abiding citizen is not about actions. It is about who has the power to escape consequences. Ultimately, crime is not an objective reality. It is a label assigned by those in power. The real criminals are not always the ones behind bars. Often, they are the ones writing the laws, funding political campaigns, and controlling the courts. So, if crime is not about morality but about control, then what purpose do prisons really serve? That's what we'll explore next. From public punishments to hidden prisons, for most of human history, punishments were public, brutal, and meant to terrify. In medieval Europe, executions, floggings, and torture were common spectacles designed to instill fear and reinforce the power of the state. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, something changed. Instead of public executions, societies began locking people away in prisons. Why? Was this a sign of progress and humanization, or just a more sophisticated way to control people? Michel Foucault, in Discipline and Punish, argued that the shift from public executions to prisons was not about making punishment more humane. It was about making power more efficient. Public punishments were unpredictable. They could spark riots or even turn the condemned into martyrs. But prisons, on the other hand, removed punishment from public view, making control invisible yet constant. Instead of scaring people with brutal displays, the state could now discipline individuals quietly, systematically, and indefinitely. Prisons were never designed to be places of justice. They were built to serve a deeper function, to normalize obedience. By locking people up, the system reinforced the idea that deviance must be corrected, that authority must be respected, and that the state has the absolute right to control bodies and behavior. But who gets to decide who is deviant? And why do some people get imprisoned while others, who commit far greater harms, walk free? The prison as a tool of social discipline. The prison system does not just punish crime, it manufactures and defines it. The state decides who deserves to be imprisoned, shaping entire social classes in the process. The clearest example of this is mass incarceration, particularly in the United States, where more people are imprisoned than in any other country. But does this mean Americans are naturally more criminal than the rest of the world, or does it mean that the system has been engineered to criminalize certain groups more than others? In reality, prisons are filled with the poor, the marginalized, and the powerless. Laws are selectively enforced to ensure that those at the bottom remain trapped in cycles of incarceration, while the wealthy and powerful rarely see the inside of a cell. Consider how drug offenses disproportionately target low-income communities and people of color, even though drug use is equally common across all social groups. Or how the rise of for-profit prisons has created financial incentives to keep cells full, regardless of actual crime rates. Foucault called this the disciplinary society, a system where people are not just punished for breaking rules, but are constantly being conditioned to self-regulate their own behavior. Schools, workplaces, and even social institutions function like mini-prisons, teaching obedience, routine, and submission to authority. By the time someone actually enters a prison, they have already spent their whole life being trained to accept control. How prisons create self-surveillance. One of the most famous prison designs in history is Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, a circular prison with a central watchtower. In this structure, guards can observe prisoners at any time, but the prisoners never know when they are being watched. This creates a psychological effect. Prisoners begin to monitor their own behavior, disciplining themselves even when no one is watching. Foucault saw this as the perfect metaphor for modern power. We live in a world where constant surveillance, by cameras, governments, employers, and even social media, forces us to behave as if we are always being watched. This is the ultimate goal of the prison system, not just to punish those inside, but to create a culture of control where everyone learns to obey before they even commit a crime. Think about how this works outside of prison. In schools, students learn to follow rigid schedules, obey orders, and ask permission for even basic actions. In workplaces, employees are monitored, timed, and evaluated constantly. The modern world itself has become a prison without walls, where people internalize the rules of the system and police themselves. If people are already conditioned to follow orders, then what is the real purpose of locking them up? The answer is chilling. Prisons don't exist to rehabilitate or prevent crime. They exist to reinforce power structures, suppress dissent, and remind everyone that the state holds ultimate authority over their bodies. Do prisons create more crime than they prevent? If prisons were truly about reducing crime, we would expect them to rehabilitate people. But the opposite is true. Prisons often create more crime than they prevent. Studies show that many people who enter prison for minor offenses come out more likely to commit serious crimes. Why? Because prisons are not designed for reform. They are designed for control and profit. Instead of providing education, mental health support, or job training, most prisons function as warehouses of human suffering. Inmates experience extreme isolation, violence, and abuse, making reintegration into society nearly impossible. And once someone has a criminal record, they are often barred from employment, housing, and social services, increasing their chances of being arrested again. This is known as the prison cycle, a system where people are trapped in a life of crime, not because they are inherently criminal, but because the system is built to keep them locked in perpetual punishment. Even worse, the prison system is deeply tied to economic exploitation. Many prisons force inmates to work for pennies per hour, producing goods for private corporations. In the US, companies like Starbucks, McDonald's, and even government agencies use prison labor, essentially turning incarceration into a form of modern slavery. The more prisoners there are, the bigger the profits. So, why would the system ever want to reduce crime when crime is so profitable? If prisons don't make us safer, don't rehabilitate offenders, and don't actually reduce crime, then why do they still exist? The truth is unsettling. Prisons are not about justice. They are about maintaining power, controlling the masses, and ensuring that the structures of inequality remain intact. So, if the prison system is a lie, what about the idea of rehabilitation? Can the system ever be reformed, or is it fundamentally designed to fail? That's what we'll explore next. The illusion of rehabilitation. We are told that prisons exist not just to punish, but to rehabilitate offenders, to help them reintegrate into society as better individuals. But if that were true, why do so many people who leave prison end up right back inside? Recidivism rates are alarmingly high worldwide, with some countries seeing over 70% of former inmates returning to prison within a few years. If the goal of rehabilitation is to prevent future crime, then the prison system is an obvious failure. The truth is, rehabilitation is mostly a lie. The legal system does not truly aim to reform criminals, it aims to control them. The entire concept of rehabilitation is built on the assumption that the criminal is broken, that they need to be fixed by the very system that punished them in the first place. But what if the real problem is not the individuals who commit crimes, but the system that creates crime in the first place? Michel Foucault argued that rehabilitation is just another form of disciplinary power, a way for the state to reshape individuals to fit its standards. Instead of brutal punishment, the modern justice system uses psychological evaluations, therapy, and correctional programs as tools of control. But these programs are rarely about genuine healing. They are about producing obedient citizens who accept the rules of society without question. The psychiatric control of criminals. One of the most insidious aspects of so-called rehabilitation is the way psychology and psychiatry have been weaponized to justify new forms of control. In the past, criminals were seen as moral failures, but today they are often labeled as mentally unstable. This shift might seem compassionate, but in reality it has created new forms of punishment disguised as treatment. Take, for example, the widespread use of psychiatric diagnoses in prisons. While mental health care is essential, the way it is applied in the justice system often serves a political function rather than a therapeutic one. Prisoners deemed mentally ill can be forcibly medicated, subjected to solitary confinement, or even institutionalized indefinitely, all in the name of rehabilitation. But are these measures truly meant to help inmates? Or are they simply ways to make them more compliant? The famous case of Soviet dissidents in the 20th century is a chilling example of this tactic. Individuals who opposed the government were diagnosed with psychiatric disorders and placed in mental institutions rather than prisons. The message was clear. Resisting the system is not just illegal, it is insane. While this example is extreme, modern legal systems still use psychiatry as a means of controlling and neutralizing those who refuse to conform. This raises a critical question. Is rehabilitation about helping people, or is it just a more sophisticated way to enforce obedience? If the goal were truly to reintegrate people into society, then why are so many ex-prisoners denied jobs, housing, and even the right to vote after serving their sentences? Prisons as factories of recidivism. If rehabilitation were real, we would expect prisons to reduce crime over time, but in many cases they do the opposite. Instead of helping inmates, the prison system often traps them in a cycle of reoffending, not because they are inherently criminal, but because society has made it nearly impossible for them to succeed after release. Imagine a person who has spent years in prison. They are released with no money, no job, and a criminal record that makes it almost impossible to find legal employment. Many businesses refuse to hire ex-convicts, landlords reject their rental applications, and even government aid programs often exclude them. How is someone supposed to rebuild their life when every door is shut in their face? For many, crime becomes the only option, not because they want to return to prison, but because society gives them no alternative. A person who cannot find legal work may turn to illegal activities just to survive. This is not a failure of the individual, it is a failure of the system that claims to rehabilitate, but actually ensures failure. The system is designed to keep people cycling in and out of prison, fueling the prison industrial complex, where every inmate means profit for private corporations. From private prisons to companies that exploit cheap prison labor, there are billions of dollars at stake in ensuring that rehabilitation never actually works. If prisons truly reformed people, the entire industry would collapse. Does the system want you to reform or just comply? Rehabilitation, as it is commonly understood, suggests that criminals can change and reintegrate into society. But what does the system really mean by change? Often it means submission to authority rather than true personal growth. The justice system does not want independent thinkers. It wants docile, obedient citizens who will not challenge its power. This is why certain crimes are punished more harshly than others. A poor person who steals food might receive a lengthy prison sentence, while a CEO who commits financial fraud that ruins thousands of lives might only receive a fine. The difference is not in the severity of the crime, but in who is being disciplined. The system rehabilitates only in ways that reinforce existing power structures. It teaches compliance, not transformation. It offers programs that focus on submission to authority rather than real empowerment. And for those who refuse to conform, the system ensures they remain trapped, either behind bars or under constant surveillance. So, if prisons don't rehabilitate, what alternatives exist? Can justice exist without punishment? That's what we'll explore next. Justice as a business. Who profits from incarceration? We are often told that the justice system exists to protect society, to punish criminals, rehabilitate offenders, and deter crime. But what if the real purpose of the system is not justice, but profit? Across the world, justice has become an industry where incarceration is not just a punishment, but a multi-billion-dollar business. Consider the prison industrial complex, a system in which governments, private corporations, and political elites profit from mass incarceration. The more people are imprisoned, the more money flows into the pockets of those who own and operate prisons, supply prison services, and exploit prison labor. In some countries, private prisons literally have contracts with the government that guarantee a minimum number of prisoners, creating a direct incentive to arrest and convict more people, regardless of actual crime rates. In the United States, for example, the prison industry generates over $80 billion annually. Private prison companies like Geo Group and Core Civic make massive profits by running correctional facilities as businesses, cutting costs wherever possible while charging the government per prisoner. The result? Overcrowded, underfunded, and inhumane conditions that prioritize financial gain over rehabilitation. But prisons are just one part of the system. From bail bonds to court fees, from probation services to prison labor, nearly every aspect of the justice system has been turned into a money-making enterprise. Justice is no longer about fairness, it's about who can be exploited for financial gain. The criminalization of poverty, who gets punished the most. If the justice system were truly about punishing wrongdoing, we would expect all criminals to be treated equally. But in reality, the legal system disproportionately targets the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable, while the wealthy and powerful often escape consequences. Why? Because the justice system is designed to punish poverty, not crime. Take something as simple as bail. In many legal systems, defendants must pay money to be released from jail while awaiting trial. But what happens if someone cannot afford bail? They remain in jail, even if they are legally innocent, sometimes for months or years. Meanwhile, wealthy defendants can pay their way out and continue their lives as if nothing happened. Court fees, legal representation costs, and fines further ensure that the poor suffer more severe punishments than the rich. A wealthy person who commits a crime can hire the best lawyers, negotiate better plea deals, and even avoid charges altogether. A poor person, on the other hand, might end up with a public defender overworked with hundreds of cases, a rushed trial, and a harsh sentence. But the most insidious aspect of this system is that it creates crime rather than reducing it. When people are fined for minor offenses, like traffic violations or loitering, and cannot afford to pay, they accumulate debt. In some cases, they are arrested for failing to pay fines, effectively turning poverty into a crime. Instead of preventing crime, the justice system ensures that poor people stay trapped in cycles of punishment, while the wealthy avoid consequences. This is not an accident. It's the way the system was designed to function. Prison labor, modern-day slavery. One of the most shocking ways the legal system is exploited for profit is prison labor. Around the world, prisoners are forced to work for little to no pay, producing goods and services that generate billions of dollars in revenue. This is often justified as rehabilitation, but in reality it is exploitation on an industrial scale. In the US, prisoners produce military equipment, furniture, and even brand name products for major corporations, often earning as little as 23 cents per hour. Meanwhile, companies that use prison labor avoid paying minimum wage, offering benefits, or allowing workers to unionize. The result? A massive pool of nearly free labor that benefits businesses while trapping inmates in modern-day slavery. This system is not new. After slavery was abolished in the U.S., laws were passed, like the Black Codes, that criminalized everyday behaviors specifically to arrest black citizens and force them into prison labor. This legacy continues today, as black and brown communities remain disproportionately targeted by the justice system, ensuring a steady supply of cheap labor. Even in countries without private prisons, governments still benefit from prison labor, using inmates for public works projects, agriculture, and manufacturing. The logic is the same. Rather than rehabilitate prisoners, the system exploits them for economic gain. So, if prison labor is so profitable, does the system really want fewer prisoners? Or does it want to keep incarceration rates high to maintain its workforce? Justice for sale: how money buys freedom. If justice were truly blind, money should not determine whether someone is punished or not. But in reality, the wealthy have countless ways to avoid legal consequences, while the poor have none. Consider white-collar crime, fraud, embezzlement, corporate corruption. These crimes often harm more people than violent offenses, yet the perpetrators rarely go to prison. Why? Because they can afford the best legal defenses, settle cases out of court, or manipulate the system to their advantage. Contrast this with a working-class person caught with a minor drug offense. While a Wall Street executive who commits fraud worth millions might pay a fine and walk free, a low-income individual arrested for possession of a small amount of drugs might serve years in prison. The difference is not the severity of the crime, it's who has the power to escape punishment. But it's not just the wealthy who benefit, it's the entire legal industry. Lawyers, judges, bail bondsmen, and private prison companies all make money from incarceration. The more people are arrested, fined, and jailed, the more profitable the system becomes. This raises an uncomfortable question. If justice can be bought, is it really justice at all? Or is the legal system just another way for the powerful to protect themselves while punishing the powerless? The myth of blind justice. The image of Lady Justice, blindfolded, holding scales and a sword, is meant to symbolize impartiality, fairness, and balance. We are told that the law applies equally to everyone, regardless of race, class, or social status. But does it? The reality is far from the ideal. Justice is not blind, it is strategic. It protects some, targets others, and enforces the interests of those who hold power. The legal system does not automatically apply the law to all people in the same way. Instead, it selectively chooses who to prosecute, who to punish, and who to protect. Consider the difference between street crimes and white-collar crimes. A young man caught shoplifting food from a grocery store might face immediate arrest, trial, and a prison sentence. Meanwhile, a corporate executive who steals millions through fraud may never even see the inside of a courtroom. This is because the legal system is built on discretion, the ability of police officers, prosecutors, and judges to decide who gets punished and how severely. And discretion is never neutral. It is shaped by race, wealth, social connections, and political influence. Those with power are protected. Those without it are punished. So if the law is not truly applied equally, who benefits from this selective blindness? And who suffers because of it? Race, class, and the unequal application of the law. Statistics prove what many already suspect. The legal system is not just unfair, it is actively biased against marginalized groups. The numbers reveal a disturbing pattern. Black and brown people are disproportionately stopped, searched, arrested, and convicted compared to white individuals, even when committing the same crimes. Poor defendants receive harsher sentences than wealthy ones, especially when they cannot afford high-quality legal representation. Judges and prosecutors exercise more leniency toward people from privileged backgrounds, particularly when they come from the same social or professional circles. Take the so-called war on drugs. For decades, people of color, particularly black men, have been arrested and sentenced at much higher rates for drug-related offenses than white individuals, despite studies showing that both groups use drugs at similar rates. The laws were not designed to eliminate drug use. They were designed to control specific populations. Meanwhile, elite universities, financial firms, and major corporations are filled with people who have committed financial crimes that cost society billions. Yet, instead of facing criminal prosecution, they settle their cases with fines, a mere fraction of the wealth they gained from their illegal activities. The law is supposed to protect everyone equally, but in practice it protects the powerful and punishes the powerless. How the rich escape justice, while the poor get punished. For those with wealth and influence, the justice system functions as a shield, not a sword. Money allows the rich to avoid legal consequences, even when they commit crimes far more harmful than those that land poor individuals in prison. How do the rich escape justice? Expensive lawyers. Wealthy defendants can hire top-tier legal teams who specialize in delaying trials, negotiating settlements, and exploiting legal loopholes. Private negotiations. Instead of facing public trials, elite criminals often settle their cases quietly with out-of-court agreements. Political influence. Many powerful individuals have connections with judges, prosecutors, and lawmakers, ensuring they receive special treatment. Media manipulation. High-profile defendants use PR teams and media narratives to influence public opinion and avoid social consequences. Contrast this with a poor defendant accused of a minor crime. Lacking resources, they are assigned an overworked public defender who has little time to build a strong defense. They are pressured into plea deals, admitting guilt just to avoid an even harsher sentence at trial. The result? The rich avoid punishment, while the poor are crushed by the system. One of the clearest examples of this inequality is the 2008 financial crisis, where bankers engaged in massive fraud that caused a global economic collapse. Millions of people lost their homes, jobs, and life savings. Yet, how many of the bankers responsible went to prison? Almost none. Now compare that to the countless low-income individuals currently serving long prison sentences for non-violent offenses. The message is clear. Justice is a privilege, not a right. Block 4. The legal system as a tool of power. If justice were truly about fairness, we would expect the legal system to work in the best interest of all people. But history tells a different story. The law has been consistently used to protect the interests of the powerful and maintain existing hierarchies. Colonial laws justified the theft of land and resources from indigenous peoples. Jim Crow laws criminalized black existence and maintained racial segregation. Anti-union laws have been used to crush worker movements fighting for better wages and conditions. Today, anti-protest laws are increasingly used to silence activists and dissidents. Even now, laws are strategically designed to maintain inequality. For example, tax laws are written to benefit the ultra-rich, allowing billionaires to legally avoid taxes while working-class individuals pay a disproportionate share. Voting laws are manipulated to suppress political participation from marginalized communities. And when people resist these injustices, the system punishes them even more. Activists, whistleblowers, and journalists who expose corruption are targeted, arrested, and silenced, while the criminals they expose remain free. This is why justice is not truly blind. The system sees very clearly who must be protected and who must be controlled. It does not serve fairness, it serves power. From physical chains to digital chains. Once upon a time, punishment was a visible spectacle. Public executions, floggings, and branding were designed to instill fear in society. Then came prisons, a subtler but equally effective tool for control. But today, the most powerful form of punishment doesn't require chains, bars, or physical confinement. It simply requires constant surveillance. Surveillance has become the new prison, one without walls, one that follows you everywhere, from the streets to your smartphone. You don't need to be locked in a cell to be controlled. All that's necessary is for you to believe you are being watched. This idea was best explained by Michel Foucault's theory of the panopticon, a prison design where inmates never know when they are being watched, so they discipline themselves out of fear. In the modern world, this concept has exploded into a global system of mass surveillance that affects every aspect of your life. Governments track your movements, communications, and even your thoughts through AI-driven analysis. Corporations collect your data, monitor your behavior, and shape your desires without you realizing it. Social norms force you to regulate your own behavior, fearing judgment and exclusion. This is the new face of punishment, one that doesn't need police officers on every corner or guards in every cell. Instead, it relies on the feeling of being watched to keep you in check. But how did we get here? Block 2. The Digital Panopticon. How technology makes you an open book. You might think surveillance is only about security cameras and police databases, but it's far bigger than that. The world we live in today is a digital panopticon where every click, every conversation, and every action leaves a trace. Governments and corporations have built an interconnected surveillance network that watches, analyzes, and predicts human behavior on a massive scale. Your smartphone constantly tracks your location, listens to your conversations, and logs your activities. Social media platforms collect your preferences, political views, and psychological tendencies. Retail stores use facial recognition and purchase history to manipulate what you buy. AI-powered systems decide what content you see, influencing your worldview without your consent. This means you are always being watched, even when you think you're alone. And the consequences go beyond just targeted ads or personalized recommendations. Surveillance is a form of power, and power is always about control. We are moving toward a world where algorithms judge who gets a loan, who gets hired, who is considered a threat, and who is excluded from opportunities. Mistakes in these systems are common, yet there is no accountability. If a human judge makes a mistake, you can appeal. But if an AI labels you as a suspect because of your online activity, who do you appeal to? Social surveillance. When society becomes the police. One of the most insidious aspects of modern surveillance is that you don't even need the government to monitor you. People will do it for them. Social media has turned society into a self-policing machine where individuals are constantly watching, judging, and punishing each other. Cancel culture has created an environment where a single mistake can ruin your reputation permanently. Doxing turns ordinary people into targets for harassment, threats, and even violence. Employers now monitor employees' social media, punishing them for opinions expressed outside of work. Students and professionals are blacklisted for past comments, regardless of context or growth. This kind of surveillance creates a culture of self-censorship, where people avoid speaking openly out of fear of backlash. When fear governs behavior, it functions exactly like a prison, without needing walls. But here's the real question. Is this a natural evolution of society, or is it a deliberate strategy to keep people in line? The future of surveillance, a world without privacy. Where does this road lead? If we continue on this path, the future may look like something straight out of a dystopian novel. In China, for example, the social credit system already determines people's access to jobs, loans, and even travel based on their digital behavior. If your score drops too low because you criticize the government, associated with the wrong people, or failed to pay a bill, you might find yourself unable to board a train or buy a plane ticket. Could similar systems become global? Many signs point to yes. Western governments have expanded surveillance laws under the pretext of national security. Private companies now have more data on individuals than most intelligence agencies ever did. AI-driven monitoring tools are being developed to analyze emotions, intentions, and risk factors before a crime is even committed. In a world without privacy, who truly has freedom? The more our behaviors are monitored, analyzed, and controlled, the more we lose the ability to think and act independently. Surveillance may not look like a traditional prison, but it functions the same way, ensuring that people stay compliant, afraid, and under control. The only difference? This time we are willingly participating in our own imprisonment. Justice or theater, the courtroom as a stage. The courtroom is often presented as a sacred space of truth and justice, a place where fairness prevails, where the guilty are punished, and where the innocent are vindicated. But beneath this polished image lies a darker reality. The courtroom is not just a legal arena, it is a stage. Court trials, especially high-profile ones, are carefully orchestrated performances designed not only to administer justice, but also to shape public perception, reinforce social norms, and legitimize power structures. Every element of a trial, the dramatic opening statements, the cross-examinations, the emotional testimony, the judge's solemn expressions, is a performance meant to tell a specific story. This is why trials are often highly theatrical, filled with suspense, moral conflict, and dramatic revelations. But here's the key question. Who is writing the script? And who benefits from this performance? Is justice truly being served, or is the trial just a political spectacle designed to pacify the masses? Are high-profile cases about punishing wrongdoing, or are they distractions from deeper systemic issues? Why do some cases get wall-to-wall media coverage, while others, often involving corporate or government crimes, are silenced or ignored? If we look deeper, we start to see that the courtroom is not just a place where justice is decided. It's a place where power is performed. How high-profile trials manipulate public opinion. Some trials are carefully selected and amplified by the media, turning them into national or even global events. These cases capture the public's imagination, spark debates, and dominate headlines for weeks or months. But why? Because high-profile trials serve a larger function. They shape public opinion, set legal precedents, and reinforce the illusion that justice is working, when in reality it is often failing the majority. Think about the biggest court cases in history. Every few years, a sensational trial emerges, drawing millions of viewers. But what are these trials really doing? Distraction. They shift public attention away from systemic issues. While people are glued to the details of one high-profile case, larger injustices go unnoticed. Scapegoating. They create a villain to satisfy public anger, reinforcing the idea that bad individuals, not corrupt systems, are the problem. Legitimization. By showing the legal system in action, these trials give the impression that the system is working fairly, even when it isn't. Entertainment. Many trials become reality TV, with dramatic twists and viral moments. The justice system shouldn't be a form of entertainment, but in many ways it has become one. The result? People feel emotionally engaged but remain politically passive. The system continues as it always has, unchallenged, unquestioned, and unchanged. When the verdict is decided, before the trial even begins. One of the biggest myths about the justice system is that trials are fair and unbiased. But in reality, many high-profile defendants are judged before they even set foot in court. Media narratives shape public perception long before the trial begins. News outlets frame defendants as either guilty monsters or misunderstood victims. Prosecutors and defense attorneys carefully construct competing stories, not necessarily to reveal the truth, but to win their case. Juries are influenced by social biases, media coverage, and cultural expectations, making their decisions less about facts and more about emotions. Wealth and power determine legal outcomes. A rich defendant with an elite legal team stands a far better chance than a poor defendant with an overworked public defender. Many people assume that a courtroom is a neutral battlefield where the best argument wins. But in reality, trials are often battles of resources, influence, and public perception. Some defendants are sacrificed as public villains, while others, especially those with political or corporate connections, are quietly acquitted or given lenient sentences. So, is justice really about the truth? Or is it about who can control the narrative? The illusion of justice. How the system maintains itself. If trials are performances, who benefits from the show? The answer is simple: the system itself. By putting certain cases in the spotlight, the legal system reinforces its own legitimacy. It makes people believe that justice is being served even when it isn't. This illusion keeps the public pacified, making them feel that as long as the system punishes high-profile criminals, it must be working. But what about the cases that never make it to court? Corporate crimes that harm millions through fraud, environmental destruction, and exploitation. Police brutality cases that are quietly settled out of court. Political corruption that goes unpunished because the perpetrators are too powerful. War crimes committed by governments that are never held accountable. These cases don't get the same theatrical treatment. They are hidden, minimized, or ignored because putting them on trial would mean exposing the deeper corruption within the system itself. The courtroom, then, is not always a place where truth is revealed. Often, it is a stage where the system performs just enough justice to maintain its credibility. So the next time a high-profile trial dominates the news, ask yourself, what bigger issues are being ignored? Who benefits from this spectacle? And what is the justice system really protecting? Why do we equate justice with punishment? From childhood, we are taught that justice means punishment. If someone does something wrong, they must suffer consequences, whether it's detention in school, a fine, or prison. Society has conditioned us to believe that without punishment, there can be no justice. But why? Why do we assume that hurting someone who hurt others is the right solution? Why do we believe that locking people away magically fixes social problems? Why do we call it justice when the state punishes individuals, but revenge when individuals punish each other? Michel Foucault argued that punishment is not about justice. It is about power. Prisons, fines, and executions were never designed to fix society. They were designed to reinforce authority, maintain order, and control populations. But what if there was another way? What if we could imagine a world where justice did not rely on revenge, fear, or suffering? A world where wrongdoing was addressed without violence? It sounds impossible, but only because we have never truly questioned the fundamental assumptions behind our justice system. Alternative visions of justice, a world without prisons. Throughout history, different societies have experimented with forms of justice that do not rely on punishment. Instead of focusing on retribution, these systems prioritize restoration, healing, and accountability. One such approach is restorative justice, which is based on a simple idea. Instead of punishing offenders, we focus on repairing the harm they caused. Victims have a voice in the process, rather than being ignored by the legal system. Offenders must face the people they harmed, acknowledge the consequences of their actions, and make amends. The goal is not to punish, but to reintegrate offenders into society as better individuals. This approach has been used in indigenous cultures, community justice programs, and even modern criminal justice systems in countries like Norway and New Zealand. Some results: lower crime rates compared to punishment-based systems, lower recidivism. Offenders are less likely to commit crimes again. Stronger communities where justice is not just about punishment, but about building a better society. But why hasn't this approach replaced prisons worldwide? Because prisons serve a function beyond justice. They uphold political and economic power structures. Who benefits from punishment? If punishment was truly about protecting society, then prisons would focus on rehabilitation, helping people reintegrate into the community. But in most countries, prisons do the opposite. They dehumanize prisoners, making reintegration almost impossible. They create cycles of violence, where people leave prison more dangerous than when they entered. They target marginalized groups, reinforcing systemic inequalities. So, if prisons don't make society safer, why do they exist? Economic interests. The prison industrial complex profits from incarceration. Private prison companies make billions from contracts, cheap labor, and government funding. Political interests. Tough on crime policies help politicians get elected by exploiting fear. Social control. Prisons keep the most disadvantaged people locked away, preventing them from challenging the system. In other words, punishment serves the interests of power, not the interests of justice. Rethinking justice, can we break free from the cycle? If we accept that punishment is not the only path to justice, what would a truly fair system look like? Instead of prisons, we could have community-based rehabilitation centers that actually help people change. Instead of police violence, we could have trained mediators who de-escalate conflicts without force. Instead of throwing people away, we could address the root causes of crime: poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity. This is not a utopian fantasy. Many places are already experimenting with alternative justice models. Some communities have even abolished police and prisons in favor of restorative justice programs. The biggest obstacle? Our own belief that punishment is necessary. Justice does not have to be about pain, suffering, and control. True justice is about restoring balance, preventing harm, and creating a society where crime becomes less necessary in the first place. But to get there, we must first challenge everything we think we know about justice. Understanding the illusion of justice. We've spent the last several topics unpacking the many layers of the justice system, the inherent inequalities, the performance-driven courtroom spectacles, the economic interests behind prisons, and the false belief that punishment equates to justice. But now we face the most important question. What can we do about it? If the system is inherently flawed, designed to maintain the status quo rather than deliver true justice, how can individuals like you and me challenge it? How do we break free from the illusion that the system is fair, just, and working for everyone? The first step is to recognize the illusion for what it is. Society has conditioned us to accept the legal system as the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. But the truth is, the law has always been a tool of social control. It has been used to protect power structures, not to protect people. To break the illusion, we must deconstruct everything we've been taught, from our schools to our media, from political narratives to the language of justice itself. Only by seeing the system for what it truly is can we begin to challenge it. Civil disobedience and resistance. Once we understand the system, the next step is to resist it. But resistance does not always mean direct confrontation or rebellion. It can take many forms, from questioning norms to refusing to comply with unjust laws. Civil disobedience is one powerful tool. This involves nonviolent resistance to laws that are unjust, such as refusing to comply with discriminatory policies, participating in protests, or engaging in acts of peaceful protest. Activism plays a crucial role. Engaging in community organizing, supporting grassroots movements, and amplifying the voices of marginalized groups are essential in pushing for systemic change. Questioning authority is key. Do not simply accept the status quo. Ask questions like, why does this law exist? Who does it serve? How does it harm certain groups? By resisting in these ways, we are refusing to perpetuate the system's myth of justice. Instead, we are creating alternative visions of justice, ones that are grounded in fairness, equity, and restoration. The power of education and awareness. Another crucial step to breaking the illusion of justice is education. The more we know about the flaws in the system, the better equipped we are to challenge it. Teach others about the true nature of justice. Don't just accept the narrative you've been given. Share knowledge about historical injustices, systemic inequalities, and alternative forms of justice. Engage in critical thinking. Learn to ask the hard questions. Why does the legal system prioritize punishment over rehabilitation? Why do certain groups face harsher penalties than others? Why is corporate crime often ignored while petty theft is punished? Support organizations that fight for systemic reform. Many nonprofits and grassroots movements work tirelessly to expose the flaws in the system and push for real change. Supporting these organizations with time, resources, and activism is a powerful form of resistance. By spreading awareness and questioning everything, we begin to chip away at the walls of the prison that the system has built around our minds. Reimagining the future. Building a just society. Finally, to break the illusion, we must reimagine what justice looks like. What does a truly just society look like? One that isn't built on punishment and control? The answer lies in systems of justice that are restorative, rehabilitative, and equitable. In a just society, people aren't judged by their mistakes, but are helped to overcome them. Justice isn't about punishing people for the harm they've caused. It's about repairing the harm and preventing future harm. To achieve this, we need to start thinking beyond the prison system and beyond punitive measures. We need to ask ourselves, how can we address the root causes of crime, such as poverty, lack of education, and systemic inequality? How can we create communities that support individuals in need rather than criminalize them? What alternatives to prison exist that can genuinely help people heal and reintegrate into society? This requires a fundamental shift in values. We need to stop viewing justice as an instrument of punishment and start viewing it as an instrument of healing, growth, and community building. If enough of us embrace this new vision, we can begin to dismantle the illusion of justice that keeps so many trapped in cycles of harm and oppression. As we've explored throughout this video, the idea of justice in our society is far more complex and distorted than we've been led to believe. From the creation of the legal system to the ways it punishes and controls individuals, we've seen how the system operates not for fairness, but for power, control, and economic gain. But recognizing the illusion is the first step toward breaking free from it. By understanding the ways in which the justice system serves the interests of a few rather than the many, we gain the power to resist, to question the system, to challenge the status quo, and to advocate for something better. True justice doesn't come from prisons or punishment. It comes from understanding, healing, and reintegration. It comes from creating systems that restore balance rather than perpetuate harm. If we are to build a better society, one that values equality, compassion, and fairness, we must start by reimagining justice itself. It's time to challenge everything we've been told and demand a system that serves everyone, not just the powerful few. The road ahead is not easy, but the first step is clear. Question the system, resist the illusion, and work toward a justice that truly heals. The future is in our hands. Will you be part of the change?